So as we move along with our very fast overview of all things that we can see dealing with environments and the factors that build them up, to the fact that we can have ecosystems and biomes without really analyzing any of the nitty-gritty of it, one of the things that we should immediately notice is, wow, there's a lot of different stuff inside of these areas, and we call that biodiversity. So we're going to look at, why do we care about biodiversity? There are a few learning objectives that turn out to be required by the College Board with this particular chat, and there are some references in the text for you. The problem with the word biodiversity is we have to figure out how we wish to define it, because diversity is actually a hard thing to define, because we can go off of what we are staring at, but sometimes we can't really tell what we're staring at. It's like saying, for the sake of giving an example that's really taboo, it's like saying, oh, we're going to classify all the people in the world based upon skin color. And then we can figure out diversity based upon skin color. The problem is, just because skin colors match doesn't mean that the groups or the humans are the exact same. And it's kind of wrong to want to clump them together, even though they might have the same skin color. The same goes with any other type of animal or plant. Just saying, oh, look, we have a bunch of different ants. Well, ants are all different. We have lots of different species of ants, so we kind of need to figure that out. It also introduces the problem of us using the word species, because species is actually a very complicated word to define, and I'm going to kick that bucket down the road just a little bit. So if you were to get some examples, and I were to ask you, which of these four turn out to be the most diverse, we need to come up with a way of putting them in order, which means we have to have a way of quantifying this. And it turns out there are plenty of mathematical ways of expressing biodiversity. The one that I learned when I was in college is something called the Shannon Index, and it makes use of natural logarithms and proportions and stuff like that. But what you can end up doing is coming up with a quantifiable number. And numbers, provided the information that you used to begin with was accurate, is going to give you a very quantitative, we don't need to argue about it version of talking about diversity. When we go to study diversity, which is also the way that we would study any type of environment, usually you need to have some method to organize yourself, and you can't measure everything. So if I were to ask you the biodiversity of Westminster High School, you can't measure every potential spot in Westminster High School, or let alone if we were to go to the Amazon basin or something like that, we can't measure everything that is there. So what typically you do is you set up a quadrant. Each one's typically like a meter in each dimension, so 10 meter by 10 meter. And we use statistics. We use randomness to pick which of those quadrants are we actually going to measure. So we sit there, we rope it all off, and then what you do is you use a random number generator and you say, okay, I'm going to look at these 5 quadrants or these 10 quadrants, and those are the areas that I'm going to use for my sample. And provided everything is equally distributed, I can now measure the biodiversity of an area without actually measuring every individual spot that exists. When we look at biodiversity, we can look at stuff from the present, but we could also look in the past, because we can look at fossils. And what we notice when we look at fossils is there's a lot of different types of fossils out there, and a lot of them don't seem to match anything that exists nowadays. So what this picture here is just dealing with what we call marine genera. So in the way that we classify things, and we'll deal with this later, the most nitpicky way that we can describe any type of organism is what we call its species or its specific name. That's like saying your first name. The next level of pickiness, so it's a little bit broader, would be using your last name, and that's what we call the generic or the genus name. So genus, species would be like your first name and your last name. It's kind of narrowing it down, who are we actually talking about. So marine genera, biodiversity, this is how many different groupings we turn out to have. How many last names can we find going from the present to about 500 million years ago. each of these, like O for Ordovician, D for Devonian, and Cretaceous and the Permian and the Triassic and the Jurassic and things like that. Actually, that's Carboniferous, sorry, for the C. K is the Cretaceous. So the Eocene, which would be getting close to now what we would call the recent area, that's where we were dealing with the modern era, the time of mammals. What we're noticing is we actually have periods of lots of diversity and then it goes away. And periods of a lot of diversity and then it goes away. Periods of a lot of diversity and then it goes away. To the point where if we were to add them all up and compare to what we have now, 99% of everything that has ever existed on Earth in terms of diversity isn't here anymore. Which is pretty scary when you look at how diverse the Earth really is. So when we think of diversity, one of the things that's always a challenge is diversity is hard to define because it requires us to look. And sometimes it's more than just being superficial and saying, oh, it's an ant, because not all ants are the same. When we deal with that, when we look at all of biodiversity that exists, we can start to notice a whole bunch of patterns. And it does make us think a little bit. We can actually take all of what we see and divide them up into 3 categories. A lot of these are small enough that we can't really see them yet because we have yet to figure out a way to look small enough. We actually have, but I mean in the course. But we can see large manifestations of them. So we have these things that we call bacteria, and we've been able to see bacteria colonies. But we also have these weird ones that live in areas that don't seem normal for bacteria, and we call those archaeans. And then we have everything else, and we call those the eukarya, whatever those words turn out to be. So if I were to take an area like, I think this was supposed to be an animated GIF, but oops. I don't know if it's GIF or GIF. I heard GIF. I've always used GIF, but I know some people are like, no, it's GIF. Whatever, we need to get over it. So if you were to take an area that would be a hot spring or a geyser, like in Yellowstone, this type of area here is not normal. Living things tend not to live in this spot, but when you see all these colors, that's because there is life in here, and we call those types of organisms the archaeans. Others, this is obviously some type of picture that isn't normal. You can actually end up seeing some type of bacteria. These are actually bacteria that live in quasi-warm environments called Thermus aquaticus. We actually are going to make use of something from them later on in the year, but we call those bacteria. Everything else tend to be big enough that we can see with our naked eyes, and we call those the eukaryotes. One of those groupings of eukaryotes we call protists, and that's just because there's a whole bunch of them. So things like here where it says Opus theoconts, those are a type of what we call protist. The amoebozoa or protozoa. The rosaria turn out to be those. The alveolates, the heteroconts, excavates. All these turn out to be different types of specific examples of what we would call protists. Obviously, there's a few offshoots, like down here we get animals and fungi, but for the most part, these are just weird groupings of things, and we're not sure what to call them, so let's call them protists. Protists tend to be really small, but some of them are rather large, like algae or seaweed. And a lot of these things we turn out to know cause disease. This thing here, it says it's a trypanosome. So this thing here actually causes a form of sickness that you can get in Africa. This here would be, if you notice, so this is corn, and then you have these weird little smudgy things. That's called smut. And this is actually a fungal disease. So if you were to actually eat this, it actually creates some hallucinogenic effects, and it's called St. Thomas's fire. Or is it St. Anthony's fire? It's one of the two. And it's called ergotism, and it helps you start to freak out, which is not the point. It's actually because you're being poisoned. We could also have trees. This one here is something called a maidenhair tree or a ginkgo biloba. They actually turn it into a powder that some people consume. You could get also types of plants that turn out to produce flowers. This one here turns out to smell really bad and it attracts flies, like that fly right there. Say it's a rather big flower because you can compare it to the size of leaves around it. But then you get to the animals. Usually when we think of life, we only think in terms of animals, but animals are a very small subsection of it. This little sucker right here is a vegetarian spider, which is odd. And we are part of this story. We are part of the biodiversity of life. One of the things that we humans seem to do is think that we are special and we are above the fray. But no, we fit right in. So when you sit there and say, oh, well, animals do this, or oh, you're talking about us. We are animals. We behave just like our animal ancestors, our other animal ancestors. So when we like to think that we are special and unique, the only thing that makes us special and unique is we're telling this story. But this story would exist whether we were here or not. But we are part of the biodiversity of the world. So in class, I have a task for you to do dealing with biodiversity.